If somebody blocks their head in a boxing match, you aim for the body. Keep jabbing them, looking for an opening. Now that, politically, it looks as though we're hitting rough road, maybe it's time we take solace in success elsewhere, without abandoning politics. Politics is a very important way, perhaps the most important way, to create change, but of course not the only way. Currently, a massive number of strikes are going on. In lieu of renewed campaigns to primary dusty old corporate Democrats, use your energy to support striking workers like those of Deere and Kellogg's. There is so much controversy right now about the BBB, and while I think we should hold the line, I really don't know that much about politicking to say for certain. Rather, when it comes to ambiguity, I prefer to switch up tactics. I am not a gambler, and I don't like risk. Now that we are slowing down on this front, and rather than giving bad advice, I prefer to say this. When one side of the enemy is becoming increasingly harder to attack, go for the other side. You can think of it almost as a pincher movement, like in warfare. We initially had success in politics getting a lot of people elected when the establishment struck back. They poured millions into campaigns against candidates like Nina Turner and India Walton. The reason we won initially, I suspect, is because they hadn't expected us. Now they are used to that tactic. So we need to switch things up, keep them off balance. We shouldn't abandon politics. Politics is important. When I debate people about tactics, I hear them tell me presidents don't create change, activists do. And this is mostly true. Lincoln didn't want to free the slaves. He was pressured by abolitionists. Wilson didn't want women to vote, but ended up giving them his support. Without legislation, and the force that legislation brings, activists would be in a much more difficult spot. Imagine if there weren't Marines sent down to protect students at Little Rock. Think of how much better the South was during radical Reconstruction when troops were stationed in the South, versus afterwards when the South began forming the KKK. When we abandon politics, bad shit happens. Nonetheless, it can be a slog, and I don't want us to lose momentum and energy. Without abandoning that front, I suggest we attack the enemy from another angle. As I've said before, the reason the enemy has so much power, in politics as much as anywhere else, is because they have money. Why do they have money? Because we give it to them. We make their products and buy their products. If you stop doing that, then they lose. Next to politics, boycotts and strikes are the next best thing. Perhaps even better. Again, it goes best if you're being political. You don't want the enemy in charge of the government, and consequently the police. Why do you think police are such assholes? But the act of working, or maybe it would better to be call it the inaction, deprives the enemy. This, in conjunction with politics, is an incredibly powerful attack. We already had political power, and now there is a massive labor shortage, or what should be called a wage shortage. And now strikes are happening across the country. If we keep this up, the bourgeoisie doesn't stand a chance. They'll have more difficulty crushing us because they lack money to buy politicians. I remember a conversation with Noam Chomsky and AOC where they talk about exactly this. Because AOC was with the Sunrise protesters who ordinarily would have been thrown out of the government, but because she was an elected official, they were given newfound respect. Just think of the early labor movement and how many strikes were brutally crushed by police and the military. There is one other thing I want to go over that I think can help you as an individual convince others. Don't be esoteric. You might think by using a 15-syllable word you come across as an authority, but to a lot of other people you just look like a pretentious prick. And others who accuse you of using something like, others can accuse you, of using something like technobabble to confuse and deceive. If people don't understand you, you're never going to get your message across. Speaking French might also make you sound intelligent, but how many people are you going to educate if they don't speak that language? Use parables and analogies. Illustrate your ideas. I'm a big fan of formal logic. A lot of leftists use a lot of facts and figures to get their point across, which is fine. That works for a certain group. The beauty of formal logic is that it starts with something observable and tangible. I know for a person like me, that's always a great place to start. You are beginning with something people can grasp and are familiar with. You start to agreed premises, and eventually, supposing your logic is correct, you catch your opponent. It's a bit like a chess match. There isn't anywhere they can run because they agreed to the initial point, and now you've exposed them as inconsistent. And even if you don't change their mind, you've shown everybody else who might be listening that they are full of shit. Math is great, but for people like me, it goes straight over my head. If I can't count with my fingers, I'm lost. I suppose it's my philosophical background. Before the scientific method, there were two ways ancient people could be certain of something. One was mathematics, and the other was formal logic. For those unsure exactly what formal logic is that I've been talking about, it's also known as deductive reasoning. You start with a general premise and come to conclusions from that. Socrates was a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. This shouldn't be confused with inferences, which isn't a terrible way to derive ideas. David Hume argued this with the sun rising tomorrow. It has a lot to do with statistics, but it still isn't as good as deductive reasoning. Your conclusion must fit within your initial premise, like a missing puzzle piece. It's not looking at clues and coming up with a theory that makes sense of what you see. That's the scientific method. Instead, it's saying, if this is true, then this, which follows, must also be true. It's more like mathematics in that way. It's fixed and certain, except for the general premise, which might be wrong, and that's where formal logic falls into trouble. But otherwise, it's a great way of testing the soundness of your ideas. And lastly, keep trying. I remember Vosh saying how fascists will win if they don't let up. If you roll the die enough, eventually the number will come up that you want. That's true and frightening. But here's the thing, it's true for us as well. If we are persistent, we will win, and we're a lot smarter than fascists. We don't have as much money, but as I've mentioned, there's ways we can nullify that advantage. The worst thing that can befall the left is doomerism, the thought that you've already lost. And every social movement goes through this, the fugitive slave law / Dred Scott decision, the murder of Ronald Stokes and Bobby Hutton, the slowdown of success for the suffragette movement after winning several states out west. But those movements that can carry on can win.